Hey, everyone! In this video, we're testing two different voices for the narration. Stories 1 and 2 are narrated by one voice, and stories 3 and 4 by another. Your opinion is super important, so you'll decide which one becomes the new voice. Let us know in the comments which one you prefer by typing voice 1 for the first or voice 2 for the second. Once we reach 100 comments, the most voted voice will become the official voice of the channel. Thanks for being a part of this. My girlfriend, Rachel, and I rented a secluded cabin for the weekend to get away from the city. We really needed it. Work had been insane lately, and the idea of disconnecting was just too good to pass up. The cabin was advertised as the perfect forest retreat, and the pictures looked amazing. A stone fireplace, a deck overlooking the valley, and a creek nearby. We arrived late Friday afternoon, and it was even better in person. The sunset cast this warm, golden glow over the place. It felt like the perfect escape. After unloading the car and getting everything set up, we cooked dinner together and settled into the living room with some wine, listening to the crackling of the fireplace. It was so peaceful, but deep down, something felt off. Maybe it was just the fact that we were so isolated. No cars, no street lights, no noise at all. Even so, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I didn't mention it to Rachel because she seemed totally relaxed and happy. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop glancing at the big, dark windows, half expecting to see something or someone out there. The next morning, we decided to explore a trail by the creek behind the cabin. It was narrow and barely marked, but it led to this incredible view from a cliffside. The silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional bird. After an hour or so, we came across something that sent chills up my spine: an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. It didn't look lived in, but there were small signs that someone had been there recently. Rachel was curious, but I felt like we shouldn't be there, like we were trespassing on something we weren't meant to see. We headed back to the cabin before it got dark, and I felt this huge sense of relief as soon as we got inside. We were exhausted, so we sat out on the deck, watching the sunset. Rachel went inside to grab some extra blankets, and that's when I noticed something strange. Across the creek, deep in the trees, I saw a tiny glint of light like the reflection from a lens. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I got up to look closer, the light was gone. I didn't tell Rachel, but my mind couldn't stop racing, trying to figure out what I had just seen. Later that night, we were in the living room watching TV when Rachel mentioned hearing footsteps near the creek while grabbing the blankets earlier. I brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The glint I saw earlier flashed in my mind again, and the uneasy feeling came back stronger. To ease my nerves, I double-checked all the locks and pulled the curtains tight before we went to bed. Even so, I barely managed to fall asleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange sound coming from outside, something being dragged across the deck. My chest tightened as I strained to listen. It was faint but steady, and my gut told me it wasn't the wind or an animal. I didn't want to wake Rachel, so I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept to the window. When I peeked out through the curtain, I didn't see anything at first, but the sound suddenly stopped. Then I noticed them, muddy footprints, barefoot, leading across the deck. My stomach dropped. I woke Rachel up and showed her the footprints. She tried to stay calm, saying maybe someone was lost and looking for help, but we both knew how unlikely that was. Who wanders around barefoot in the middle of the forest at night? We decided to lock everything again and waited out until morning. We sat together in the living room, barely speaking, every tiny noise making our skin crawl. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the windows, we didn't waste a second. We grabbed our stuff, tossed it into the car, and drove off without looking back. On the drive home, Rachel kept saying it was probably nothing, maybe just some harmless weirdo passing through, but I couldn't buy it. We stopped at a diner for breakfast, and while we were there, I decided to call the cabin owner. He sounded friendly at first, but when I mentioned the footprints and the knife we found on the deck, there was a long pause. Then he said, in the most dismissive tone, "Never had any issues like that before." It didn't sit right with me, like he was trying to sweep it under the rug. Rachel told me to let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "Hope you enjoyed your stay. Come back soon." My blood ran cold. I hadn't given my number to anyone except the rental site. I showed Rachel, and her face went pale. We both agreed it was creepy, but when I tried to trace the number with a friend who works in tech, he hit a dead end. No name, no location, just a random burner phone. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even back at home. Now, every time I hear a strange noise or see someone lingering nearby, my mind goes straight to that weekend. I've become obsessive about locking doors and windows, even in broad daylight. Rachel says I'm paranoid, but she doesn't argue when I check every room before bed. The thought of those barefoot prints and that weird message still keeps me up at night. It's not just the idea of someone being out there, it's the feeling that whoever it was isn't done with us yet. I've always been the kind of guy who organizes trips with friends just to break the routine. After months of nonstop work, I suggested renting a house in a small town for a chill weekend. It was just me and 3 friends: Mark, the guy who always handled the practical stuff; Ryan, our self-proclaimed chef; and Chris, who couldn't care less about anything as long as there was Wi-Fi. The house looked perfect on the app: spacious, a big backyard, and even a grill. When we arrived, it looked even better than the photos, but something was off. There was this older guy sitting on the porch, acting like he already lived there. It threw us off immediately, but Mark, being the most assertive, went to ask what was going on. The man, who looked to be in his 50s, said his name was Tony and that he had also rented the place through the same app. He even showed us a screenshot of a supposed reservation. At first, we were skeptical, but he seemed friendly and calm, so we agreed to share the space for the night. None of us wanted to ruin the weekend over an argument, but as the evening went on, something about him started to bother me. It was like he was watching us more closely than he should. After we settled in, everyone scattered to their rooms to unpack. Tony didn't have much with him, just an old backpack that he tossed on the living room couch. While we were prepping dinner, he just sat in the kitchen, silently watching us. Every time I glanced at him, he was staring, like he was analyzing us. It wasn't outright threatening, but it was unsettling enough to keep me on edge. Later that night, after a few beers and some laughs, we were starting to relax. Tony had a drink or two, but didn't say much, just quietly observed everything. When it got late, he went to the room next to mine, and we all locked our doors. It was obvious none of us felt entirely comfortable. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of slow, dragging footsteps in the hallway. I tried to convince myself it was just one of my friends going to the bathroom, but then the steps stopped right outside my door. My heart was pounding as I stared at the shadow under the door. I stayed completely still, straining to hear anything else. Then I caught a heavy breathing, like someone was standing just inches away listening. I wanted to call out to Mark, who was in the room next to mine, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, slowly moving toward the other rooms. When I finally worked up the nerve, I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and carefully opened the door. The hallway was pitch dark, except for a faint light coming from the living room. I crept toward it, my footsteps as silent as I could make them. When I got there, I froze. Tony was sitting on the couch, completely still, staring out the window like he was waiting for something. But that wasn't the worst part. He wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, there was someone else, wearing a hood, crouched down and rummaging through Tony's old backpack. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. The floor creaked under my foot, and the hooded figure stopped what they were doing, slowly turning their head toward me. I couldn't see their face, just a shadow, but it was enough to make me take a step back. Then Tony, without even looking at me, said in the calmest voice, "Don't worry. He's not going to do anything." That made my stomach drop. He didn't sound reassuring. He sounded like someone who knew exactly how much control he had over the situation. Panicked, I ran to Mark's room and banged on the door, whisper shouting for him to open up. There was no answer. I pushed the door open, and to my horror, the room was empty. The bed hadn't even been touched. I rushed to Ryan's and Chris's rooms, but they were gone too. It was like they had vanished. My mind was spinning, and the only thing I could think of was finding something to defend myself with. I bolted for the kitchen, but when I got there, the hooded figure was standing in the middle of the room, blocking the way, their head tilted slightly as if they were mocking me. I froze, my legs refusing to move as the hooded figure just stood there. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their stare, cold and piercing. Without thinking, I turned and ran back toward the front door. I grabbed the handle, pulling and twisting as hard as I could, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside, My breathing was frantic as I tried to think of another way out. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps and a low chuckle that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, lights flooded the house, and I heard voices yelling from outside. I spun around to see flashing red and blue lights through the windows. Police officers stormed in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Is everyone okay?" one of them shouted. Before I could answer, Tony and the hooded figure were being forced to the ground. I was shaking so badly that I could barely speak, but relief hit me like a wave when I saw Ryan step out of his room, his phone still in his hand. He had locked himself in and called the police after hearing the footsteps and realizing something was seriously wrong. The officers checked the entire house and then sat us down to explain what they found. When they contacted the property owner, it turned out that only we had a legitimate reservation. There was no record of Tony or anyone else booking the place. Hearing that confirmed what we had already suspected. They weren't supposed to be there, but the bigger question was why they were there at all. Tony and his accomplice refused to say anything, and the police hauled them off for trespassing and further questioning. Even though the immediate danger was over, none of us could shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something far worse. The fact that they had no legitimate reason to be there, combined with their strange behavior, was terrifying. We stayed up the rest of the night to shake into sleep and left the house as soon as the sun came up. It's been months since that weekend, but I still can't stop thinking about what might have happened if Ryan hadn't called for help in time. One thing's for sure, we'll never take safety for granted again.
It was a long weekend, and the plan was simple. Get out of the city, enjoy some peaceful scenery, and disconnect for a bit. My boyfriend, my best friend, her boyfriend, and I all piled into the same car, chatting and laughing non-stop. The problem started with the traffic on the main road. It was unbearable. We had been stuck for almost an hour when we decided to ask a local for an alternative route. He seemed friendly enough and pointed us to a narrow road, saying it was much faster. "Not many people know about it," he said. At the time, it sounded perfect. As soon as we hit the road, we noticed it was indeed quiet, maybe a little too quiet. No houses, no gas stations, not even another car, just trees and bushes stretching endlessly on both sides. The further we drove, the more it felt like we were going nowhere. The sun was starting to set, and saving time no longer seemed like a valid argument. We had been on that road for at least 2 hours, and to make things worse, our GPS started acting up. At one point, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just driving in circles. With the tank running low, we were starting to get genuinely worried. The tension in the car was palpable. No one was joking or laughing anymore. Then, like a sign from above, we spotted a small billboard, Hope Hotel, 3 miles ahead. The name sounded a bit generic, but the idea of finding a place to rest and deal with the fuel issue seemed like the best option. When we finally arrived, the hotel actually looked charming. Simple but well-maintained, with a warm light glowing from the entrance. The older man at the front desk was polite and quickly handed us keys to 2 rooms. At first glance, the hotel seemed cozy, but something about it felt off. The other guests in the small lobby didn't even try to hide the fact that they were watching us. It wasn't exactly hostile, but their stares were unsettling, almost like they were sizing us up. My friend was the first to whisper, "They've been staring at us since we walked in." I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just our nerves after hours of stress on the road. But deep down, I couldn't shake the uneasiness creeping in. After dropping off our bags in the rooms, we headed back to the lobby. We didn't want to seem rude, and maybe some interaction would ease the tension, but the feeling of being watched only got stronger. The guests were speaking quietly among themselves, but every time we got close, the conversation stopped. An older couple sitting in a corner whispered and glanced at us, and a lone man who looked like a trucker kept sipping his beer while staring at my boyfriend. It felt like everyone knew something we didn't, and they weren't going to tell us. Back in our rooms, we locked the doors and tried to settle down, but my friend texted me, "Have you noticed they avoid answering any questions about the area? It doesn't add up." She was right. Every time we asked the staff about the nearest gas station or an alternate way to the main road, They would change the subject or brush us off. It was like they didn't want us to leave. The more I thought about it, the more I regretted stopping there. Around midnight, the hotel was eerily quiet except for some muffled sounds in the hallway. I tried to ignore it, assuming it was just other guests moving around. But when my boyfriend went to look through the peephole, he froze for a moment before stepping back. "There's someone just standing outside our door," he whispered. My heart raced. There were no knocks, no attempts to come in, just that presence, lingering. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, fading down the hallway. It wasn't paranoia. Someone had been there. Minutes later, the faint sound of movement echoed again, but this time further away. My friend texted, saying they felt uneasy in their room too. That was it, we couldn't wait until morning. Something wasn't right, and the longer we stayed, the worse it felt. We decided to leave immediately. Quietly, we packed our things, texted my friend and her boyfriend to meet us at the car, and agreed to get out without making a scene. We left our rooms almost at the same time, trying to make as little noise as possible. The hallway felt longer than before, and every step made the floor creak louder than it should have. By the time we reached the lobby, the receptionist was still there, sitting behind the desk with a blank expression. He didn't say a word, but watched us closely as we walked toward the door. It sent a chill down my spine. He didn't seem surprised we were leaving so late, and his gaze lingered on us until we stepped outside. Once we got to the car, relief hit us for a second, but it didn't last long. My boyfriend turned the key, and the engine sputtered but wouldn't start. He tried again, and still nothing. Meanwhile, my friend, who was looking around nervously, whispered, "Those two guys from the lobby earlier, they're out there by that shed." We all turned, and sure enough, two figures stood in the shadows near the edge of the property, completely still, just watching us. My stomach dropped. It was clear they weren't just out for some air, they were waiting for something. Panic started to set in as we got out to push the car, hoping to get it moving. The adrenaline was insane. We weren't even speaking, just focusing on getting away. I glanced back, and one of the men by the shed was talking on a phone. It felt like the clock was ticking, and I couldn't shake the thought that they were planning something. After what felt like forever, the car finally started. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off without looking back. The road felt even darker and more endless than before. No one said a word, but we all kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following us. After what felt like hours, we spotted the lights of a gas station ahead. It was the first sign of life we'd seen in what felt like forever. When we pulled in, the gas station attendant seemed friendly enough, but his expression changed the moment we mentioned the hotel. "You were at Hope Hotel?" he asked, his face tightening. When we nodded, he shook his head and muttered, "You're lucky you got out of there. That place, people disappear there, always have." Eric and I had finally managed to escape the city for a cozy little cabin we found on a rental site. It was small, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense trees. Everything seemed perfect, except for one detail. The host had warned us there was no cell service in the area. We didn't think much of it since we were there to disconnect and enjoy the peace and quiet. On our first night, we lit the fireplace, had a simple dinner, and settled on the couch with a bottle of wine. Everything was going smoothly until we heard a sound outside, a sharp crack, like twigs snapping underfoot. Eric laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. But the way he glanced at the window told me he wasn't as calm as he wanted to appear. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard heavy footsteps on the deck. I froze, trying to convince myself it might just be the wind moving something outside. Eric grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but he didn't find anything. "Probably a raccoon or something," he said, trying to sound relaxed, but his voice had a nervous edge. We went back inside and locked the door, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to a strange noise, like something scratching against the wood of the porch. My heart was racing as I nudged Eric awake. He heard it too, and we both stayed silent, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Eric got up slowly, motioning for me to stay quiet while he grabbed the flashlight again. He crept to the living room window, trying to peek outside without being seen, but he shook his head when he came back. "I can't see anything out there," he whispered, his voice tight. The noise outside continued, more rhythmic now, like someone deliberately dragging something across the deck. My mind raced for a logical explanation. A tree branch, an animal. Deep down, though, I knew it wasn't that. Eric suggested we stay locked in the bedroom, just in case, and waited out until morning. We barricaded ourselves in the room, locking the door and propping a chair against the handle. Eric kept the flashlight in his hand while I clutched my useless phone, still showing no signal on the screen. The sound outside shifted again. This time, it was a soft tapping on the living room window, like someone was testing if we were awake. I whispered to Eric, "What if someone's trying to break in?" He just shook his head, trying to keep his composure. Then we heard it. Footsteps, unmistakably human, circling the cabin, and right after that, a low whistle started, faint but constant, sending chills down my spine. The footsteps stopped just beneath our bedroom window. We sat frozen, barely breathing, as the whistling ceased. The only sound was the pounding of our hearts. Suddenly, something hit the window hard. It was a sharp, loud thud that made my whole body jump. It sounded like a rock or something heavy had been thrown at the glass. Eric squeezed my hand, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, holding the flashlight tightly and aiming it at the bedroom door, as if expecting it to burst open at any second. Minutes dragged on like hours, and then we heard it again. Footsteps, this time moving toward the front deck. Eric whispered that we couldn't just sit there and wait. He grabbed a knife we had brought from the kitchen earlier, insisting we check the rest of the cabin. I didn't want him to go, but deep down, I knew he was right. Carefully, we unlocked the bedroom door and crept into the living room. Eric checked the front door. It was still locked, but then we noticed something that made our stomachs drop. On the fogged-up glass of the living room window, someone had drawn a strange symbol with their fingers. It wasn't there before. The symbol looked like a poorly drawn circle with crisscrossing lines, like something meaningless yet unsettling. I didn't know how to react, but Eric looked determined to figure out what was happening. He leaned closer to the window, trying to see outside without turning off the lights inside. "I can't see anyone," he muttered, his voice uncertain. The footsteps had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet again. Then we noticed it. The back door leading to the small rear deck was slightly open. "Did you lock that door?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. Eric nodded quickly. "Of course I did," he replied, already walking toward it but hesitating before getting too close. Slowly, he shut the door and secured it with every lock we had. "Whoever's doing this knows we're in here," he said, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. Just as he said that, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the outside of the cabin started again. This time, it was coming from the left side, near the bedroom window. My stomach churned. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. The dragging sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was even worse. Eric motioned for us to hide in the farthest corner of the living room. "Whatever this is, we're not opening that door," he whispered, his voice shaking. We sat there, pressed against the wall, barely daring to breathe. Then came the knock, 3 solid thuds on the front door, loud enough to echo through the small cabin. Eric stood up quickly, gripping the knife tightly. "Who's out there?" he yelled, his voice stronger than I expected. There was no response, just a low, chilling laugh from the other side of the door, followed by silence. Eric stayed frozen for a moment, and then the sound moved again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin, near the bedroom window. It was clear now. We weren't just dealing with one person. "They're messing with us," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Eric nodded but didn't say anything. The whistling started again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin one more time. Then, just as suddenly as it started, It stopped. The rest of the night was dead silent, but we didn't sleep a second. At first light, we packed up and left as fast as we could. The cabin, which had felt so cozy and welcoming when we arrived, now seemed like a prison. When we stepped outside, we found footprints around the house, more than one set going in and out of the surrounding woods. The outdoor lights were damaged, and on the broken window pane, another symbol had been drawn, slightly different from the first. We never found out who was there or what they wanted. To this day, I still wonder. But one thing's for sure, I'll never stay somewhere that remote again. It's not the wilderness that scares me anymore. It's the people hiding in it.